PT. I'm going to say, what?
Sive, like five.
Sive. Good, I was going to say Charlotte. I was going to say it wrong. Sive O'Flynn from the C3, and then Zach Trogdon, also DRPT. Thank you all for joining us online. What I was going to mention is, as this is our first meeting, I think it was December 11th or December 16th, the city of Charlottesville voted to join the authority as official members, and December 11th, I believe, the county of Albemarle voted to join as initial members. Then in their January governing meetings, they also appointed initial members. So we have 4 initial voting members around the table. We are going to ask in the short term if we can elect an interim chair and vice chair until the bylaws are approved, so that we have somebody that can walk us through the agenda as that chair in the short term. But what we're going to be doing today is first asking for volunteers for that interim chair and vice chair. We are going to allow for public comment, as this is a public body and a public meeting. We are going to try to set a regular meeting cadence of frequency and which time of month works for everybody. We are going to review over the draft bylaws that very much mirror the enabling legislation. And then we're going to talk about some goals and some initial intent for the transit authority in the short term. And then number 6 is really discuss more a little bit longer term and what next steps might be, and a progression towards what next steps are. Okay, so I think the first one is to kick us off, and is anybody willing to in the short term serve in an interim role chairing? And that is going to be materials provided to you. We're going to be coaching you through just in the short term until we have adopted bylaws.
Is that, this is just over the course of a couple of months? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would nominate.
My last year, I can see this out. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna let you take it easy that last year.
December 31st.
I would suggest if you're interested in being vice
Happy to.
chair, you go.
All right, and both of you are willing. Do I hear that in a form of a motion to have Diantha McKeel as the interim chair and Natalie Oshrin as the interim vice chair of the Transit Authority?
So moved.
A second.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Could you just third it and everybody is now voted?
Now what I'll ask Ms. McKeel is just to walk us through the items on the agenda. You can take it as lead from here, and then we will let you know. Oh, right. That's helpful.
All in favor?
Got a first and a second.
Okay, yes, good catch. So we have a chair and vice chair. Our next agenda item, public comments. So I'll turn to Lucinda to see if we have anyone who wants to speak, and it's 3 minutes per speaker.
If anybody from the public would like to speak, please use the feature, the raise your hand feature, to raise your hand and let us know that you would like to speak.
Nope.
No.
Okay. So seeing no
Okay.
hands raised, we
All
can
right.
minimize that.
So our next agenda item is selecting a regular meeting time for our calendars, which is critical.
And I think this one is really throwing this question out to you all. We certainly have a staff recommendation, but wanted to hear from you guys on the frequency at which you think the authority you would like it to meet, the length of the meetings. I mean, I don't know that we want to go too far into calendars right now, but we definitely need to make sure that we're avoiding council meetings and planning commission meetings and existing PDC standing meetings. So we really wanted to hear from you. Have you any thoughts on the frequency with which you meet?
Because we all have so much time. Right, not
And also
everybody.
happy to share the staff recommendation, but certainly wanted to pose it to you all
Why
first.
don't you share the recommendation with us?
All right, one of the thoughts that we were having is right now the intent is to leave the regional transit partnership in place in the short term, eventually with the goal of sunsetting that group and having the authority be the regional transit body. But in order to reduce duplication, since so many of you serve on both of those, we were thinking of perhaps a cadence of every other month. So on alternating months, we have an authority meeting, and then in the alternating month, we would have the partnership meeting. And since that's already held on folks' calendars, we could have the authority meeting on those 4th Thursdays from 4 to 6.
So,
Rotating back and
is
forth
the idea
between.
that you're also cutting the number of RTP meetings in half?
That's correct. That's correct.
So we thought we would, the suggestion was to alternate, which really simplifies our calendars a lot.
Makes sense to me.
And so we would start, this would be February, and then March we would have authority, and in April we would have,
Partnership.
so we would count this as the March, and start with our rotations. I mean, it could count this as February, and then start with our rotations in March.
I'm good with that.
Do we need a vote on that?
I don't think so. I think what, we would like to just set expectations that we will then be sending around cancellations for existing partnership meetings and starting a new, meeting hold calendar. One of them is the authority, and then a separate recurring one for the partnership, so that when the one sunsets, we can just cancel that one and the authority remains on the calendar.
And then we have a partnership meeting next week,
We do.
so we'll talk about this at the partnership meeting so that the other folks know. That work? And then they will get a cancellation for the alternate meetings.
If I could just point out, the bylaws provide that regular meetings, the schedule will be determined by a resolution. That's what the bylaws say. So what we may, if that's,
Formalize it.
if that's what the group wants to do, then we'll prepare a resolution for you all at your next meeting to identify, is it like the fourth Thursday, is that right? The fourth Thursday at 4 o'clock for the, every other month. And we could even say odd months or even months, depending on what it is, for that. And that'll confirm with the bylaws.
That works, and then we can take care of that next week.
Next month, April.
Well, we can notify the partnership that the authority is looking to meet every other month,
Right.
so the
So that
partnership
there's
is
not-
meeting.
Right.
So who's meeting in March? The partnership is meeting in March? Or
This
the-
group.
This
group
group.
will be hard.
Okay.
So we'll count February as, and then we'll move to the partnership next month,
Okay.
because everybody's expecting that, so.
I'm sorry. So we already have a meeting for the RTP next
We
week,
will still hold
Next
that
week,
as scheduled.
but then a month from now, we will have this meeting again?
Yes.
yeah.
We will have the fourth Thursday be the authority.
The fourth Thursday of March
Yes.
is gonna be partnership though. I thought
No,
we
we're gonna
That's-
talk next
no.
week
Okay.
about going ahead and
Still
making
have
it every other
February
month.
RTP,
So
We're
the
trying to use
March,
this meeting, yeah.
CARTA, April RTP.
Okay, I was getting lost. in
Yeah.
that.
It's okay.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
too.
We're doing both in February.
Right, yeah, that's the way to say it.
Because this is like the organizational meeting, so the first regular meeting will be in March.
That works for everyone. Great.
And that does keep us moving a little bit with this group. Try not to lose time.
And then as far as the authority meeting, 90 minutes or 2 full hours. Right now, the partnership is scheduled for 2 full hours. I would ask your opinions on if, in this initial phase, if we wanted to keep it 2 hours on the calendar, and if we end early, great. Or if you want us to revise it to 90 minutes.
I think the start time would remain the same,
Yes, 4 o'clock.
4 o'clock.
This one's 5, but we would put it from
This
4 to 6
meeting, Yeah.
Like we do
with the partnership.
Some of the members of the board work and asked that this meeting start after.
Oh.
Yeah.
well,
I had asked that with this one. If we are trying to overlap them with the RTP, I could. What I was concerned about is having one more meeting that takes
Right.
has to be my
Okay.
workday. I would still prefer a 5 o'clock meeting to a 4 o'clock meeting, but,
I would
if
too.
we,
Well, then let's do that.
Let's do that.
That's fine. I don't have.
I wasn't expecting a easy majority.
Is that what you got?
Yeah.
So 5?
And
So
that's
the
if it's-
authority meetings will start at 5. We'll leave the partnership
Okay.
at,
Do you need
Is that
a
all
full
right?
hour and a half at 5?
Let's start with an hour and a half and see how it goes.
I need more time.
Hope
Is
it's not
that
2
a
hours.
problem for y'all?
No, because I think a lot of the planning work that we bring to you probably won't have underway by March or by maybe May.
I try and be conscious every time I
Yeah.
suggest any meeting schedule that goes after a normal workday. I'm like, well, y'all also have a workday.
I very much appreciate that.
We work at the pleasure.
We appreciate the acknowledgement.
Yes, noted.
I
Great.
think probably planning on that extra time, and then we can always leave off. We finish what you think.
Extra time,
And then
hour and a half.
hour, or
I think
say
hour
an
and a
hour and a half, right? And then if we leave early, and then if we can see the cadence, we might want to schedule it back an hour, but at least that works to get started, is that okay?
No one will complain if we adjourn the meeting.
That's right, they never do, I always say that.
Great. So so we have set a regular meeting time, and we will prepare a draft resolution for the next meeting in March. Formalizing that.
So our next agenda item, reviewing the bylaws. And I would imagine you, Ann, and Ben are gonna take this one on.
I think I'm gonna do most of it, and then Ben will talk a bit about committees. Okay?
Okay.
And so just to remind everybody on CARTA that the bylaws, the original bylaws that we prepared were modeled after the legislation that was approved by the Virginia General Assembly, and we also used other bylaws from other authorities that were, that existed in the state. And our bylaws very closely mimic the ones for the Richmond Transportation Authority, because those appear to be the bylaws that sort of work the easiest for us. And what I'm prepared to do for you all is walk through these bylaws section by section to see if there's any changes. I think our goal would be to get to as close of a version as possible so that we can make any changes and then bring the bylaws back to you all at the March meeting. Okay, so first section reminds everybody it's grounded in the legislation approved by the Virginia General Assembly. Article 2 talks about membership in the authority. It identifies the city of Charlottesville and Albemarle County as the initial members. And this is really just from the legislation, identifies Louisiana, Green, Louisa, and Nelson may join the authority. And that other private nonprofit tourism-driven agencies, higher education facilities in the area, and public transportation agencies can also join the authority. Now, being a member is different than being on a board, because there's another section for board membership. And then it goes to section B. I'm gonna keep going until somebody waves their hand and starts.
I'll throw in one minor edit that I didn't catch before this, but in the last sentence of the second paragraph, it does say that they joined as initial members by concurrent ordinance. The legislation allowed for ordinance or resolution. I believe both of you all chose resolution as your
Okay,
means for.
okay. Thank you for catching.
How do we understand the meaning of public transit agencies in this capacity? I can just anticipate it being raised by John or comparable agencies. But John,
It is inclusive, okay.
Yep.
John would
They're a
be
public
one.
service.
Yeah.
I have a question. All or such portions of the county of Albemarle, why is it not just the county of Albemarle?
That language is directly out of the legislation, and I think, and I'm gonna stop, I think it's because the transit services are only in a portion of Albemarle County, not the whole county.
Okay.
But the county did not join as a portion of Albemarle, I believe the county joined as Albemarle County.
I agree with that.
Okay, now we come to Authority Board, identifies 2 members of the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors, 2 members of the City of Charlottesville, City Council, 1 member from each of the governing bodies of any county that chooses to join. And then the board can identify 4 additional members of non-voting representing agencies, institutions, and facilities that can join the authority. So that references up to the private nonprofit tourism-driven agencies, higher education facilities, public transit agencies. So are we good with that board membership?
Do we have 4 in mind? Or where did 4 come from? Is it just like a nice?
Or was in the legislation, and I don't think, we've not talked about 4, that might be a topic that we would put on the agenda at a later date for this group to identify whether or not you would like to, we need them to join, and then whether or not they would like to be part of the board as non-voting.
And then if someone else turns up and you need to amend it to 5 or whatever.
Okay, I'm
But
not
or
sure I get it, that we
specify.
can, yeah.
Oh,
I
okay.
think we can because of the way the
Unless there is a change in
Okay.
the legislation.
Right.
It's a legislative thing. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and you should probably note also, these are non-voting
Yeah.
members, which in the legislation is very explicit. If UVA is one of these members that joins, they're not allowed to
They're
vote.
not
Right.
voting.
Right, John, they cannot vote.
And that was also feedback that we got from some of the rural localities, is if you're trying to amend this so that UVA can start being a voting member, we're really not interested in being on your board.
But
So-
also
Remember that.
just observe for everyone, the way it's set up, if we maximize the size of the authority, the rural counties are a equally sized voting block compared to the initiating localities at the table.
And that is out of the legislation.
It would be a 4D4.
And one thing that we may want to do going forward is if we do find things, and this is legislation that's existed for some time, if there are suggested changes, we could package some of those suggested sort of technical revisions to the legislation, the membership, the organization, if we needed to do that.
I think this covers the ones right off the top that we would really think about, like John, don't you? Yeah, UVA. I mean, I don't think we're leaving anybody out that might right now say, oh goodness.
Okay.
You may also look at, I think this allows us to bring in a VDOT or a DRPT if we wanted to have a state membership be a part of this as well. So.
Should be great.
Which would be good, yeah.
And would you see CAT essentially being under council on this?
I think that's something we'll need to talk through because as an entity of the city, it's kind of already represented, right?
Yeah,
So
that's what- yeah.
that might be something y'all want to talk through. Does that make sense for them to do that? I think that's pretty good.
And just as an example, the CDTA in Richmond has their Commonwealth Transportation Board, DRPT, Senator, so they're other members, they're bringing in state level representatives versus at the local.
Section 3 makes it so that if a director is not available, a organization can substitute another person, another elected official to attend the meeting. Any issues with that?
So that's designated.
Right, designated. The term of office is identified to coincide with the elected official's term of office. And will be filled in the same manner. We get to Article 3. Article 3 talks about officers. The bylaws officially call out the election of a chair and a vice chair, but an additional officers can be designated, can be elected at some point in the future. The term of office of the officers are 2 consecutive 2-year terms. You can only be an officer if you are on the board.
So is it the annual organization serve for a term of 1 year? Say 2? No more consecutive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm confused.
Oh, let's see, you might have got, there might have been a mistake. Officers of the authority will be elected at the annual organizational meeting, which the bylaws specify will be in July, to serve for a term of 1 year or until a successor is elected or sooner. All officers are eligible for re-election, provided, however, there are no officer may serve more than 2 consecutive 2-year terms. That should be 2 consecutive 1-year terms. So I'll make that correction.
Unless you wanted to contemplate, do you want officers to have 2-year terms? We do that in some of the other,
NPOs like that.
yeah,
Is this a legislative thing?
That's what I'm looking
that
at right
this
now.
is would be, I think our
I'm fine with
decision.
annual.
All right, this is not, I'm gonna do a quick check. I do not believe that this is in the
I
legislation.
don't think so either, that's what I'm looking at as well.
I just know that some of the others have 2 years.
Roughly 2 years.
There is something to be said for continuity, and people get
I don't know.
on a roll and then they understand it. Just whatever you all want. to do.
Right, the only thing that the legislation says about officers is the authority board shall appoint a chair and vice chair from, among its members, so it doesn't identify a term. So that's up to you, you all can choose to make them 1-year terms or 2-year terms.
What is RTP? Is it 2 or 1?
1, but our jail board authorities 2.
NPO is 2.
2. There's something to be said for the continuity, but, yeah, I mean, I don't, it's whatever you all want to do. I won't be around. It's up
I
to
was
you
gonna
guys.
say, if we're doing elections in July, but the terms run concurrently concurrent with the elected officials' terms.
It gets kind of crazy.
That doesn't quite match up.
And I was gonna mention the fact
That's why the
that,
MPO does first.
and I was gonna mention that we have our elections, according to this, in July. I've always thought that was awkward because we nominate people for these positions in January, our boards.
Mm,
So I'm just thinking it through here.
Okay.
Now's the time to think about it.
That's right.
That's it.
that's a great point.
I just think it's easier if you start when our appointments start, like January.
Yeah, the calendar year.
It makes sense to me.
So we can identify the annual meeting as a January annual meeting. That would be the preference of the group.
Then you'd elect your, and you all would know who is
And it
appointed.
would still be in the later half of January,
Yeah.
so there wouldn't be a concern of
Yeah.
possibly not having the members.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense.
I think that makes more sense to me than July. I've always
And I
thought.
think 2 years makes sense if this is something we want to have the same sort of gravitas as the MPO at some point.
And I think it works really well with the jail board and some of the others that I've been on to have that 2-year. Because it does provide continuity and
Okay.
you have to know that, yeah.
Okay, so 2-year terms and 2 consecutive 2-year terms would be the max.
Yeah.
Okay?
Which
Yeah.
doubles the max.
4 years.
And then the January.
Right.
Yeah, you got that, okay.
So then it calls for a nominating committee, and then it defines the role of the chair and the vice chair.
And then my new detail, if the authority is meeting in March, then we are meeting in the odd month, so they would meet in January. Great. I wanted to make sure it
That
wasn't
works.
first meeting of the calendar year, so we
That
didn't
works.
lock into January.
That's good.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, we already, so just to go back to this nominating committee, it's saying that the meeting preceding the annual election in January, we would be nominating people.
Which will be November.
So
And you may not
Can't-
know at that
Well,
point.
we would know
everybody.
who the elected official is, but they won't be around to
Yeah.
participate.
is that a problem?
Because it'll be post-election, pre-swearing in.
Yeah. Complicated.
Okay, at a regular meeting preceding the annual election of the officers, the chair will appoint a nominating committee. Well, it says the chair will appoint a nominating committee at the meeting,
Not a
but it
nominee.
not nominate.
So there it
So
is.
that, we're okay.
It's like, how do we get, our chair is, gone now, for December 31st, how's that gonna work?
Yeah.
At the annual organizational meeting, the nominating committee will submit the name or names of one or more persons for the office of chair or vice chair, so I think we're good.
Okay.
And for both of our organizations, we'll have most of the month of January. 'Cause
Right.
we meet, make them up. Yeah.
Okay, anything else on officers and duties?
So the chair is responsible for the implementation of the actions taken. What does that mean? Is that like with the mayor or whatever?
If we need a signature, the chair's the one that is responsible for signing it, I think is what that's trying to get to.
And policies, if the board has if you have a policy, and some of, it's important to point out that some of these transportation authorities, they might work outside of the local government, and so there may be specific activities that they're doing that chair would be responsible for.
And the chair appoints the nominating committee for one thing. Some of those sorts of things maybe. Brian.
But we are happy to wordsmith that if
No, I
you
think
wanna
it's fine, I'm just sort of
Okay.
like.
What does it entail?
Yeah, what does it mean?
Yeah.
I guess like with being the chair of the
It
jail
sounds like a
board, there are
big
certain
thing,
things.
and then it turned out to just be signatures.
Pre-agenda meetings, nominating committee, make sure that that's appointed, some of those sorts of things.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay.
good, thank you.
Vice chair, talk about. I made the change under annual organizational meeting that will be in January. Okay? Regular meetings, we identified, we have to pick a date, but we'll need to do this by resolution.
Right here it is.
So we'll prepare a resolution for for CARTA for you all to approve. The bylaws call for a special meeting to be called. If 2 or more authority directors would like to have a meeting, you provide a request in writing to the chair, specify the matter. the chair would immediately work to coordinate a site and a time. And then notify the public of the meeting.
Is there any statement in here, I'm jumping ahead, but is there any statement that references the PDC as the matrix or enabler of all of this?
It does not. And we have not done that in here. Now, we could do that. And you would want the PDC identified as the convener.
I guess.
The other thing that we discussed in the working group is perhaps it could come in the form of an MOA of the role of the PDC
Oh, yeah.
serving as staff to the authority, and maybe not put that into the bylaws, because then anybody could be that convener,
Sure. That's
but in the short term, do it as a draft.
So a memorandum of understanding or something like that.
Okay.
That
Do we need
works.
to mention that? Like, there will be a convener determined by a separate memorandum of understanding, see addendum A.
That isn't necessary for the bylaws. It's not gonna change anything.
Do we need to have anything in the bylaws about digital or virtual meetings?
There,
We can
okay.
tell you.
Oh, okay. I tried to scoot ahead to see, but I didn't.
He's getting all the fun stuff.
Sorry.
Rules about virtual meetings.
Item D says we'll adjourn the meeting to another date and time certain. E talks about public notice of the meetings. F talks about holding public hearings. G identifies that we function as an open meeting. The board can have closed meetings for specific purposes identified in the Virginia Freedom of Information Act. It identifies that a quorum of the members must be available to, a majority will constitute a quorum, but that vacancies will not be considered for purposes of the quorum.
So a majority is 3.
And the only difference with this and what we have for the partnership is that we say we have to have a representative from
I was just gonna mention that,
both the city and the county.
that you can't get the majority out of like 2 from
And I
one
think that's a
jurisdiction
good
and then
thing.
1 outside other. You
Because
have to have both city and county present.
we
for
did that
one.
on purpose because we were having trouble. And we didn't want to have meetings with just
Where
one
decisions were made,
community.
yeah.
Do you,
No, I
do
agree.
you want to make that change here? So we want to say that a quorum, a representative, a director representing
Albemarle and Charlottesville.
Albemarle
You have to have
and
someone from both
Charlottesville
communities
must be present.
to establish the quorum. And we've had it come up before, and we can still have the meeting, we just can't vote on it, you know, yeah.
Okay, we're good with that?
Yeah.
Okay, there's, you can identify, have temporary absences. And so you can
what does
hold
that
the
mean?
meeting, you can, and this basically says somebody can leave the room, you can still have discussion. You just need to know that somebody's left the room. Item J mentions that, decisions will be made in one of the, by resolution or by motion. If it is a resolution, it'll be made in writing, we provide a resolution in advance, and a copy of the proposed resolution will be provided to all of the authority directors. And then there can be a motion, which would be an oral motion provided. Votes, of course, they'll be made and seconded, taken by voice or roll call.
And my experience as chair is that the voice votes were very confusing when you have voting and non-voting members. And that's why I've moved to a roll call vote. Because I realized that some people didn't know they were supposed to be voting on that. I'm just saying, so it's something to think about. We have voting and non-voting folks. I don't know if we want to hold it too, but we might want to just say a roll call vote. Because I just found it,
Of voting members.
other voting members, yeah.
I don't have a problem with that.
Just
So
to
do you want to just take?
I just think it's a
We'll
lot
just say by,
clearer.
well,
And
okay,
it's not
fine.
like we have 50 people.
Okay. So we'll do, all voting will be by roll call,
Yeah,
okay?
a voting member, yeah. I think that's right. I just think that simplifies it when you're, especially for the chair and even for the person that's trying to take the count, right?
Okay.
So, okay.
Okay, then, the meetings will start, of course, the regular time at the hour specified. I feel like that makes a lot of good sense. The agenda, they'll prepare, the chair will work to prepare an agenda. Of course, that's where the PUC comes forward to help with preparation of the agenda. A member can add items to the agenda by submitting them to the chair in advance. It does say in here that the agenda will be provided, the chair will provide the agenda at least 10 days in advance.
It doesn't give you a time limit for the inclusion on an appropriate agenda. We might want to say, for example, Mike, we have the Monday before our Wednesday meeting. I mean, we do have a, you know, if you're gonna bring something up or add something.
So we could say we'll submit them to the chair no less than 1 week prior to the meeting.
1 week is fine, 5 days or whatever you want.
Well, we've got 10 days.
But you have to
Yeah.
post it 10 days, yeah.
The
So-
agenda has 10 days.
Okay, so do you want to say no less than 5 days prior to the meeting?
I mean, the idea is that if you have an agenda, but you can certainly add something if something comes up. So I wouldn't make it 10,
Initial
I'd cut
agenda,
it,
and
yeah.
then,
Well, the open meetings requires 3-day notice to the public. So is there a difference here that we're trying to establish with a 5 or a 10? or
That
do we
may be
just
why
wanna
we
say-
have Monday in hours for our Wednesday meetings. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
The open meetings has what? The
A
agenda?
3-day requirement of notice.
3-day to the public. So if you're meeting on a
That you're
Wednesday, you have to
meeting.
provide the materials that you provide to the board 3 days in advance of the meeting.
Right, and this is probably, 10 days is probably written just to give the directors ample time to
read.
review.
Right,
So
And then updates up to
right.
3 days before.
Yeah, I wonder if we could just say, will be provided in accordance with open meeting requirements?
But I would think that this,
Or do you
I
want
would
a
think
number?
you all would want to have, ordinarily, you would want to have those agendas to you prior to with more time than just
You want-
3 days to review.
I would always want a weekend. At least a weekend.
And I think that 3 days is written so that, because I think boards need flexibility and need to be agile, so if something comes up and you need to have a meeting, you don't wanna have to wait 10 days for the meeting.
Right.
This is just really about the agenda.
not
Right.
all of the packet materials.
Right.
Right,
Just what the
right,
topics
and
will
it, right. And the 3 days is the minimum to achieve.
Right,
It
and
doesn't mean that's what you ought to work for is maybe a bit more notice so that.
Yeah.
10 days sounds good.
It's 10 days,
Well, 10 days for the first draft table, and this is what it is, and then you can add to it up to
We
5
don't do
days.
that now.
We don't do that for any of our
not
so
bodies.
that's
I
the
would not do
question.
that.
Do we wanna, do you
Yeah.
wanna say a
Yeah, I
week?
would be hesitant. Yeah, the law says 3 days. The PDC's practice on any other board or committee has been 1 week in advance so that it always overlaps by a weekend.
And you give a weekend that way.
Okay.
And that's,
So
so
I would
people
say
have
we
time to
follow the
read
law,
it.
but we continue
Yeah.
with our practice to send all materials out
Yeah.
1 week in advance.
Okay, so I'm gonna start back. The chair will provide, the last sentence on here, the chair will provide the agenda at least 7 days in advance. But this also gives a board member the authority, permission to add an item. So how much time do you want to add the item?
And that's where I was saying 3 days, because that seems to be,
3 days prior to the meeting.
and you're only gonna, that's in a special circumstance where somebody's added,
Right.
which doesn't really happen very often.
So if we're doing a week in advance, the first one, can you just say 4 days? So
Sure.
you read your thing over the weekend and come in Monday morning and tell us what you need. I guess it's a little bit more.
Sure.
Okay,
That's fine.
perfect.
So 4 days in advance, 4 days, okay.
Yeah, because then we can get it into the full packet that goes out. to the
That
public.
works, that's
Okay,
great.
4 days
That
in
works.
advance, and the agenda will be done 7 days in advance. Okay.
Can I ask a question about something we kind of passed already? If we're done with the
Sure.
agenda calendar. So, for the voting paragraph, it says proxy voting is not permitted. But then back at the beginning for designees, it says the director may designate another official to attend the meeting of the authority board,
To attend in their place, but not.
but
take
not
votes.
But not to vote.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that it's
Yep.
not a,
Good question.
thanks.
And we're gonna take minutes. Oh, there can be closed sessions based on, reasons that are permitted by Virginia law for closed sessions.
that follows.
Okay. Item P allows the board members to participate electronically. Now, there have been some recent changes related to that, is that right? So we may internally want to check this paragraph to see about those, Christine.
The requirement within the Freedom of Information Act is that the board would adopt its electronic meetings policy annually. So there will be a written policy for this that would be adopted annually
Okay,
by requirement.
okay.
Is that something we can
So we
just
probably
copy
just
paste
put that in,
what
don't we
you
need to say that
That's
in
an
the
annual.
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah, our
In the
policy
January
has some
meeting,
things that
that's an agenda item every year.
Right.
you got it.
Right. Okay. Then Q talks about how business will be conducted, persons addressing the authority. This is some more work that we will need to do going forward. What's the policy and the guidelines? We'll need to prepare guidelines for a board to accept public comment. And we'll work on providing those guidelines and maybe copy and paste some of those guidelines from other.
Sure, we all have guidelines that we can.
For the NPO and for RTP, is it 2 minutes?
We
I
have 3
think it's
minutes.
3.
We three. And that's pretty standard, I
We
think.
just read through those.
Okay, the board can reorder the agenda, the board chair,
Oh, yeah,
okay?
at the meeting if you need to,
Right.
yeah. that works.
The recognition will be given only by the chair, and nobody will speak,
I thought this sounded very severe.
okay,
just-
Robert's rules out here.
right?
I was
Questions.
I use Bobby's.
That speaks about questions and authority discussion.
Party discussion.
Any questions about Q, order and conduct of business?
Can I actually, I apologize, do a significant backtrack?
Sure, which one? Go to.
H, which is on quorum, and I want to make sure, I want to get some clarity on how everyone else is interpreting the phrase vacancies will not be considered for purposes of a quorum. There are 4 directors. Suppose I resign from the board tomorrow. I am now a vacancy, and there are 3 directors. Is a quorum now 2, or is it now 3? I don't know what we mean when we say vacancies are not considered.
Your vacancy is not considered towards that math, so it still would be 3. You would still need to be replaced by another
See,
county
I
supervisor.
I would have interpreted it the other way around, right? Because vacancies aren't considered means there's 3 directors.
That's how I was reading it.
Yes. And we may want to, I've had the county attorney review these, or one draft early on. When we make the final changes, I'd like to have a county attorney review that, and I'm happy to send it to the city attorney review. But I would see it like you, Supervisor, if you resign from the board and thus you are no longer a part of CARTA, then that is a vacancy, so the quorum then would be 2. And in this case, the quorum would be 2, which would have to be a city and a county member.
So if there's 2 county people that resign, then you can't have quorum.
Correct.
Correct.
Anyway, if you don't have representatives from the locality,
You would have quorum anyway.
yeah, it's not a group, yeah,
And
exactly.
I think that's pretty normal for vacancies, that vacancies don't count towards quorums.
Yeah.
I think it would be.
I think that's normal. Okay?
All right.
Okay, I'm gonna go, and then the last section that I'm gonna do is, the quorum, and it basically says the chair's responsible for keeping everybody in line. Take a look at that.
And
see if
then
there's any
others.
questions.
On to committee.
Okay, and I'm gonna pass it to Ben to talk about committees.
So both of these committees were from the legislation. We talked about some other committees that we could include, but we decided leave that to y'all to decide. The 2 committees that are in here are a finance committee and a technical advisory committee. The finance committee is aimed at basically having our financial staff from both city and county sit at the table and sort of understand what are the region's finances when it comes to transit, what are our options. This will get more complicated as we start folding the fund as a part of CARTA. Once we move beyond sort of the planning level thing and start talking about dedicated funding, this becomes a very, very important committee. But to start with, it's just sort of reviewing what transit agencies are doing, how we're spending money on transit in the region. The second committee is a technical advisory committee. Right now, we have it set up so that it is basically staffed by the current staff that is the working group, but with additions of DRPT,
Okay, I was gonna say DRPT.
DRPT,
Yeah.
VDOT,
Right.
and then a representative from a non-voting member would be included as well, and we're looking to potentially include UVA as that non-voting member. We've had some conversations with them about collaborating through this, and that seems like a good opportunity.
Can I ask a question? So the finance committee, understand all these duties. Membership, the committee will consist of 5 members of the authority,
And I was hung up on that too.
or 4 so far.
Well, does that
So-
include non-voting members?
I wonder if it should be.
Members in terms of the city of Charlottesville as a member. And you can appoint anybody who works for the city of Charlottesville, or you can appoint anybody who works for the county, because you are the 2 members.
Okay,
And members could also, to look at page 1, include these tourist-driven
Right,
agencies,
right.
public transit
right.
agencies, higher education facilities. And those do not need to be limited to members that have a director that is a non-voting member,
Okay.
right? So if we
I
added
see, so
DRPT, John Rural, John Urban, UVA, and CAT, right? That exceeds the number that could be directors, but they could all be members for the purpose of assigning people to the things.
so then I'm hung up with
The
where it
committees that
says
we're talking about.
consists of 5 members of the authority. That's what,
he's talking, basically what Mike is saying is
yeah,
all the other folks that are connected, that we will.
we might wanna change that verbiage though, because they're not necessarily gonna be 5 members of the authority, we would wanna be able to bring other,
Non-voting?
you see what I'm saying?
5 representatives of members of the authority,
Right,
right?
appointees,
So for example, if I'm.
Currently, there's 2 members of the authority.
right.
Would we understand that to mean we can't fill it? I don't think so. Sorry, I didn't mean, I stepped on you.
No, it's all good. If we wanted Ben to be on the finance committee, would he be there basically just as sort of participating in our, sort of a stand-in for us? or
Well,
would
the
he-
member of the authority is the city of Charlottesville, and then Ben is the representative of the city of Charlottesville.
Right, so you could, on the finance committee, you could have your CFO serve on that finance committee.
Right.
You could have any member that you appoint as the city of Charlottesville.
I wonder if to capture these kind of concerns into
Yeah.
like a representative tax, it would be like
Yeah.
5 persons who are part of members of the authority.
Or who represent.
Because I'm also not sure we want to box ourselves into a corner where we also, I think we would want to write it in a way that we can have multiple from a single member.
I agree.
Oh, I mean, we have to, right?
Right now.
We could say the committee will consist of 5 persons
Mhm.
who represent members of the authority.
And who are appointed by,
And, or,
and who are appointed by.
Appointed by
the
the
board.
authority. So the directors appoint the 5,
Are
and the 5 can come from any of the
Right.
contributing parties.
by the directors or the members, who are appointed by whom?
They're appointed by the board.
The board.
By
what's the difference in a
By the
director and a
authority.
member? A director,
A director is a person, a member is an organization.
there you go, okay. Just trying to,
Albemarle County is
Parse
a
this
member,
out.
and you and I are directors.
yeah, got it.
So I have, the committee will consist of 5 persons who represent members of the authority and are appointed by the authority board.
I like
Is that good?
Yes.
Okay.
That
Okay.
clarifies it.
Thank you,
That
that's a
works.
great correction.
So wanna make it sound extra lawyery, you could say natural persons.
Oh.
To differentiate from legal persons like LLCs.
Okay, do you want me to say that?
No.
No, we're not even. I thought it was pretty good on the vacancy thing, I don't know about the natural person thing, okay.
So those are the two committees. You're not constrained to just those two committees. There is nothing that actually
So let's look at the
explicitly says that
membership
you
of
can
the-
create more, but you can,
Yeah,
according to
is the
the.
membership for the technical committee though, is it okay? I wanted to have a chance to look at that.
Sure.
Since we just changed the other
Yes, let's take a look at that.
consensus
Do
up
we
to
use the
6.
same language, we will consist of up to 6 voting members?
Well, does this mean that the committee has 6 voting members who vote on things within the committee,
Right.
not
That's
director
right.
voting members?
Yeah, that's what
who
I.
are
I'm just saying, whatever the
participating?
language we came up with for the finance
Right.
committee with that.
Do you wanna change, you wanna mimic that same language?
This is much more specific because it talks about
Yeah.
VDOT and I do like on the technical advisory committee to have that expertise of VDOT and DRPT for sure, right?
Yeah, I see that it's not capitalized to indicate that it's a different word, but I would still avoid using the word members here for confusion's sake.
So 6 voting persons?
Persons representing the membership.
Voters.
Yeah.
Voting
6
persons.
voters.
How about, why don't we-
Annual
why don't we
voter.
take voting out?
Yeah.
Let's just take voting out, 6 persons representing,
That's good.
I think the reason we may have kept
Number.
that in
Just
initially
have
is
there's one
because,
non-voting member.
well, the
Or, sorry,
3 members
Three
are all
non-voting members.
non-voting.
But, I mean, that can be,
And the tech committee is gonna be voting on things to recommend to the board, so the voting part is a functionary thing.
okay. So I have,
Functional thing?
different
word.
the committee will consist of up to 6 persons representing members of the authority.
Who will have voting power within this committee,
Who will have voting power?
within the committee,
Well, we're talking about the committee.
right?
Right, but
That's
some of the
correct.
members
Oh, okay.
on the committee
Okay,
are not
okay.
voting.
I got it. That's nice.
Yeah.
That's good.
there's, yeah.
Each of the
This is the
members-
correct set of ideas. I'm sure there's probably a slightly more elegant way we can write it on the back end.
Now, the one thing is that we should not limit the technical committee to just people just members of the authority,
No.
because, for example, we might want VDOT and DRPT to be on the technical committee, but they may not be members of
Right.
the authority.
So that's what we were just saying.
And so we
really
keep
want
the rest
these-
of
We
that.
want these.
Okay, and then we'll just say, we'll add, they can also have one, right, also,
All the rest of that is fine, it's really just the first
the
sentence.
first sentence,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
That needs
3
the
members.
clarification.
And I was trying to think if there were any other technical groups besides VDOT and that we needed from DRPT, but I guess that pretty much covers it.
Okay, okay, we're good with the members and the committees. We're getting close to the end. There's some more information about quorum,
Yeah, there's one
performance.
more notice on the committees in section E, which says you can create more if you'd like. We're not recommending any additional committees at this time, because we'd like to get the first 2 stood up and functioning, but if there are other roles that you find necessary for your own advisement, you have the capability to.
Okay. And then, any questions about that?
So there's just something saying the chair appoints a nominating committee. Did we cover the nominating committee? Okay, it doesn't need to be, it's here,
It's
That's
right.
E.
and that's
And
okay.
it's just short
Okay.
term for that.
That's fine,
Yeah,
all right,
okay.
that works.
Okay, then the last, I think these are, I thought they were the last 2. Sections 6 and 7 are really important for the future. 6 talks about staffing, the ability of the authority to hire an executive director and some staff. It's important to point out that the bylaws say that the executive director will not be a director of the authority, separate.
And I hope we get to the place where we do
Wouldn't that be
that.
awesome?
That would be really cool.
And then the authority can have staff. It's actually pretty nice to go ahead and start thinking about that in the bylaws, even though that's an aspirational kind of place to be. It also talks about finances, what's important in here is the idea that at some point we're not there yet. We might talk about funding formulas, begin to identify what funding formulas might look like when we have revenue coming in. That would be a great discussion to participate in, is when we're trying to figure out how funding formulas work. That means there's funding coming in, that's a good thing.
Good, yes.
Right. It does say that
This
we
is a
will,
place where, so, and we agree we don't need to specifically reference the PDC in this document?
right, I think, it does say that, the authority can employ or contract for staff as the authority board. So I think that contract for staff could be that MOU with the PDC.
And we talked about the MOU.
Okay. D says that there will be an annual budget, and you will adopt it. And it begins on July the 1st. And we'll do that, we'll get that budget ready to go on July the 1st, which means we would have to
Right.
adopt that annual budget in May
Right.
for July, since we're an odd,
Right.
the CARTA is an odd month.
Right. So go back to audits, the Commonwealth's auditor of public accounts, or such auditors is legally authorized to represent us. Well, audit the authority. What is that?
There is a position, I chatted with Steve, it's funny you bring that up, I chatted with Steve Rosenberg about this before he left, and I'm gonna be honest with you, I do not remember what he said.
That just seems, I mean, we all get audits, and we expect an audit, but it seems strange that we would go to the Commonwealth's auditor of public accounts. But maybe it's an authority we do, I mean,
I don't know if I can find that. I
Is that
feel like
in the original?
I do not
legislation?
think that is in the original legislation, let me check and see.
that's something we might have to look into after this at some point. We certainly want an auditor, I'm just not sure if the Commonwealth auditor is who we.
And is it normal to have it done annually also?
Uh-huh, we always have an audit annually, our audits annually.
On my quick review,
Well,
I do not see this as.
No, but
in the
my assumption is
legislation.
if this board ever gets taxing authority, it would need to be audited
yeah.
by the,
Yeah,
so I think that's what this is referencing.
Oh, the
Is that
taxing authority makes.
the Commonwealth
goes on
Auditor of
Richmond.
Public Accounts will annually audit the
That's it,
financial
because of
accounts.
taxing authority, that makes sense.
And right
now.
now, we don't have.
And we don't have that now, okay, that makes me feel better, I understand.
So that is
Thank you.
something that probably is in the original language.
It is not.
It's not in the legislation, but I think that's something that we saw in other existing authorities language in.
That makes
bylaws.
sense.
This is going to be just me asking for some quick, public economics education. I was under the impression that, like, local governments still contracted out, like, third-party accountants to do this work.
Yeah.
Is it that that these third-party accountants and accountancy firms are licensed representatives, or are they turning these documents over to, or is there just a separate audit?
That would be a legal question we'd want to get clarified. I don't know the answer to that.
I chatted with Steve Rosenberg about this, and I cannot remember what he said. How is that? Is that fair?
Yeah.
Is
No, I
that
understand.
honest? It was warm outside, I remember it being really. It's terrible, but that's what I remember
Just like-
about it, that it was warm outside, I don't remember the
It's
conversation.
legally discussed.
Right, it's just.
It's been so cold this year
Why
that
don't
the
we follow
reform
up
day
with
Right,
stood out.
I will commit to going back to the attorneys to see if I can understand it, because I had never heard of this position, from my North Carolina experience, I had never heard of this position, and I remember calling and we talked through it, I just don't remember what he said. And I will
I'm
commit to
thinking
get
our
that.
auditor, like, I've heard Mr. Sumner talk about, like, our auditor that we hired.
We,
Before.
because it's an
I know my
outside,
father-in-law once did, and got a contract to audit the books of Spotsylvania County.
but you want
So I'm like,
somebody
well,
from
he's
the
not-
outside to
he's not the
audit the
Commonwealth's
books, you know, it has to be someone that's not. within
Yeah,
the
and obviously
organization.
the city and the county raise taxes.
Right.
We have our own, we have our own independent audits
Right,
that's done by.
every year.
So now I'm like, maybe all these guys are legally authorized representatives of the Commonwealth's Auditor of Public Accounts, and I just don't know that.
I'm gonna just check real fast and see if I can find
They sent you an email.
Yeah.
I don't,
Well, I
I feel
mean,
like
there
we
is-
chatted about it.
I think this is something we can also
There is-
get
there's
clarity
a
on.
staff
offline and
later.
separate
Here is a
back and
maybe
forth.
PDF
all-
he sent me about it. He did send me a PDF about it.
Oh, well, that's good.
It says,
Auditor of public accounts.
it says the auditor of public accounts acts as the General Assembly's eyes and ears, independently monitoring and reporting how state agencies and institutions spend taxpayers' money. The APA helps the Commonwealth leaders address challenges facing Virginia today by providing sound, reliable information. The auditor, a constitutional officer elected to a 4-year term, reports to the General Assembly through the JLARC, the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee. While the auditors are defined by the Constitution, the Code of Virginia, it has a work plan.
So I wonder, because this is like an agency of the government as opposed to created by the General Assembly, right?
It goes,
As opposed to like a municipality or a county jurisdiction, maybe that's the difference.
this says, while the APA does not perform audits over local government financial statements or local funds or operations, we perform other oversight functions to assist in improving accountability and financial management for the Commonwealth's local government. Our office prepares and distributes annual audit specifications unique to Virginia local audits, along with guidelines to assist localities compliance with certain accounting and reporting requirements. Additionally, we perform quality control reviews over local audits performed by public accounting firms to ensure the firm's audit work complies with the auditing standards and the APA audit specifications, along with any federal requirements if the local government receives federal funds. So I can shoot this out to you, you can see that it exists, and so it looks like, I think we have to understand how how those two interface. And it may be, to Christine's point, that if there is direct taxing authority to come through, is where we would have to pay some special attention to this.
Right. So while we have no money.
It's a really quick audit right now.
That's right.
Okay. Then, we talked about per diem, we can, if there were money, if we had money, there could be some per diem that specifies this. And then, bonding, it does provide in here, Christine, that, the officers of the authority and any employees are bonded.
Is that required in the?
Prior to taking office or starting, officers of the authority and such employees may be required to give bond payable to the authority conditioned upon the faithful.
And I don't believe it's called out in the legislation.
So an officer would be one of the directors? You would be bondable?
And are the employees the TJPDC?
No, they're any of the administration under Article 6. Which I guess if we're extending that.
Sorry, officers is actually only the chair and vice chair.
So the chair and vice chair.
Because it's anybody associated with money, right? And some of these sections are in here, I believe, related, well, we drafted them, but they're copied out of these other organizations because they have money. And having bonding for people who are dealing with financial records is probably very appropriate.
Does that help me understand that? That's essentially a form of insurance? May be required to give bond payable to the authority. So if Diana is the chair, she's required to give bond payable. What is that?
I'll give you my first one.
Right, but it goes on to say that the authority pays for the bonds,
The premium for
which is
each
sort of
section.
equal to like an insurance. And this is a section that I'll specifically call out to the attorneys to let them take a look at bonding. And most of that would relate, I believe, to whether or not there were funds, that money coming in and money being dispersed from the organization.
And a chair and vice chair is, might be
You're
signing
signing
off
checks,
seal of some sort,
right.
like checks and.
Familiar with like boards, like nonprofit boards having an insurance policy against the board.
Like a detail.
But this is something I'm not as familiar with. So. I get it, I think,
Directors
but
and officers.
Yeah.
So this we can check on.
We'll follow.
Presumably, we're protected from legal, being sued from a lawsuit, given the fact that we're elected officials. This is a different,
this is a different thing. Well, this is, I think, ensuring the authority against you.
Yes, against
Right.
embezzlement or whatever might, yes, that would be my understanding.
but to your point about directors and officers, do we need something like that for this, or are we covered because we're,
We
We're
can
here
ask
now.
attorneys, I've only ever seen that in nonprofit
Yeah,
organizations.
I don't think
haven't
it would
seen
be.
D&O insurance in any of our other,
yeah. that makes
Well,
Great
I think
question.
Yeah.
the thing that would make more sense than D&O insurance would be a like MOU with the localities to defend, right?
To come under,
Yeah,
And-
like the BZA
Yeah.
has, right?
right.
Right, or that if you all, if you, at the Albemarle, if, at the Albemarle representatives, if you act on
Behalf of.
the, CARTA,
Mhm.
are your actions on behalf of CARTA covered under
Under
your,
Albemarle County.
under
And
Albemarle
the same
County?
thing for it.
Right.
I guess
So
that's the
let
question.
us spend a little time just
Yeah.
chatting about it, about insurance. I think that is a great question to make sure we check it out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and like the question of whether or not, the counties would indemnify the authority is actually
Mhm.
kind of thorny now that I'm thinking about it. That's a
Right.
lot to give up. And maybe and to your other question, right, like the authority would be at least partially immune in a lot of circumstances, but you still have to go to court.
That's okay, the courts are full right now.
Okay, and then the last section, I think this is the last section, second to last section, is how bylaws are changed. Any proposed amendment or repeal or alteration is presented in writing and read for the first time, and then it comes back at a second meeting,
Yeah.
or a special meeting. And then finally, we all agree that we'll use Robert's rules of order to run the meeting.
Yeah. Bobby.
for that one, let me make sure I formed this thought right. There is the official Robert's Rules of Order, but there's also the
The
abbreviated.
and
I
that's what
think we mean the abbreviated.
Yeah, I would
Robert's
make
Rules of
sure-
Order is incredibly,
I would say that
Detailed.
for sure,
Yes.
abbreviated. I call it Bobby's, but yes, because the other, if you really are following it, it is very,
I don't pretend to know Robert's rules.
Okay.
Well,
so
very
we'll
good.
identify
We would
that as
be
it's the
abbreviated.
abbreviated.
Get the abbreviated manual in
And
my
many of
office
what
when
we
this
operate
question
on-
come up.
And many of
I
our
see.
committees and all operate under.
Under the abbreviated.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody have any
It's a
other
point.
changes or suggestions or thoughts about the bylaws?
My question has to do with, different use of the word bond, but bonding capability at some point. Like, for example, the jail board, the water board has the ability to go out to the bond market and raise money in that way. Is that something that we could decide later, or is it something that should be part of the bylaw, or is that?
That is part of the legislation.
Do we need to add like a
Bond.
definition, so we know we're talking about this kind of bond versus that kind of bond?
I mean, again, I would presumably be under the finance piece,
Because authorities, that's right, authorities can take on that debt.
and that's really.
And that's really
one of the-
important.
Yeah,
The
the
legislation
legislation, oh,
specifically
you got
calls
it.
it out.
Yeah, it says, provide by resolution for the issuance of revenue bonds and the authority for the purpose of paying the whole or any part of the cost of operating any transit system. So it does talk in this about.
So do we need to
have the
put that in
authority to
here?
bond.
Well, we don't,
I don't think so, no, that makes sense.
We just leave it in the.
right, because the powers of the RTA are not actually identified in the bylaws
I
are
was
how
about
we're
to
gonna
say,
run
there's
it.
no enumerated powers
Right.
Right.
to include issuing debt.
Okay.
But the legislation specifically calls that out.
Good,
Okay?
got it.
So
Well,
when we
I
say
mean,
like
Article
functioning
one,
part of the legislation,
we shall have the powers of the legislation.
that is whatever that legislation is.
Right, so you all can do these 14 things that are identified in the legislation.
Very cool.
But at some point, I guess, the members who are, ought to have a copy of
It's
that.
an applied power,
Yeah.
an applied power
Just
CARTA,
yeah.
driving the bus.
It does not say driving license. I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry.
We don't get
Although
a
if you get a
CDL license
CDL,
for
you get your
That could be a
CDL,
bonus.
you get a CDL,
You
they
apply
can
the
put
per
you out.
diem to a CDL class.
I mean, that sounds like a great political stunt to me. Re-election campaign 2.0.
It always needs more drivers.
Honestly, it would be fun if you.
I
I've
would love
thought
to
about it
see
too, maybe that's what I'm doing.
Except for backing up, I could never, I would be no way to.
I've told Supervisor McKeel this, but I very slow-mo casually almost ran into a light post at the corner of Avon and Market because I don't know how to drive in the snow, so I think it's best to keep me away from CDLs, buses, any of this. Unless it's in a nice empty parking lot where I can hear donuts.
So we're,
I'm
No
gonna,
more
I'll make
questions
these
about
changes
this.
and I'll send everybody a corrected version.
okay,
Okay?
that's
Thank
right.
you so much.
And we'll have
Thank you.
those
Thank
ready
you for this great
for
discussion.
the next meeting.
We'll have them ready for the
And
next one.
will the updated version be track changes?
Would you like them track changes?
That would be-
Okay. Happy to do that.
Thank you.
It's nice to get track changes and then a clean copy. Yeah.
Okay.
So goals and intent for CARTA.
Yeah, so I'll work us through that
Right.
one, and I'll try to be pretty quick with, because I know we have one more piece after this. I just wanted to review sort of what are the foundational kind of documents that we would be looking to sort of inform our discussions going forward. There are really three that I think we'll want to focus on going forward, starting with the regional transit vision plan. We handed out a document that gives you sort of the guiding principles behind that, the goals. I'm not going to go over all of the goals for that, but I will go over sort of what were the recommendations coming out of that and what are we leading to. Second document that I think is really important for us to all look over once again is going to be the transit governance study, which recommended that this body go ahead and set itself up. And then the third document is one that we have not created yet, and it will be the first sort of document that we're going to be leaning on the board to help us create. And that is going to be prioritizing what services that we want to go after first. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But first, I'm going to start with the transit vision plan and talk through what those recommendations were. The very first one was do a transit governance study. So check, we did that. The second one is identify corridors and services for a regional service or RTP, RTA to champion. So that's kind of what we're leaning towards for our prioritization study. Looking at what are the specific routes that are coming out of this transit vision plan that we can put money behind in the near term and get them moving quickly. Third recommendation, continue meeting as the RTP. Apparently we thought that was very useful, so we said keep doing that. Consider some scenario planning when you're looking at these routes to champion, especially when we're talking about longer term investments. We need to understand, what if things don't work out quite the way we thought they were going to? We don't necessarily have that built into our current studies right now, but that is something that we'll need to look forward to in the future. When we're looking where we want to invest, the transit vision plan points to first, we should be looking in underserved areas, areas where we can add frequency, and we should be looking at those areas before we start talking about making additional large capital investments. So put the service out on the ground first. If you need to start making improvements to bus stops, if you need to buy more buses, if you need to do major capital investments around the transit service, that should be sort of second priority behind getting service out on the ground.
Ben, could you remind me, so is this language going back to constrained, unconstrained? Okay.
Yep, exactly.
So this is the constrained
Is
version?
this a constraint?
These are the recommendations that point to, I don't think the plan says, constrained or unconstrained, but it does sort of give you guidance on going forward as you're implementing things from either the constrained or unconstrained. These are the sorts of things you want to keep your eye on. They want you to continue to work with regional stakeholders to make transit supported land use and connectivity investments. So invest in your bike ped networks, make sure that you're densifying your land uses around transit. Improve workforce development. I think at the time we were really struggling with number of drivers for CAT, JAWN, for our school bus services, and so this was a really important priority for us at that point, was how do we get drivers? How do we develop these drivers and make sure they're trained up and then don't leave us to go be truck drivers? I think that's still a really important thing for us to focus on, and make sure that we're on top of the transit agencies, that they know that they need to do that. And then develop service guidelines for evaluating performance. So we're gonna say all these things that we want, how do we evaluate whether they're actually performing correctly? So that's the transit vision plan. It gives us those two networks of constrained and unconstrained, and that sort of led to, well, how do we actually pay for this? How do we build it? Who's actually running these things? And the recommendation from our first study says, do another study about governance. So we came back at the end of that study, started another study that was focused on governance, got into a lot of detail, started talking about, you know, if we did this tax versus that tax. But what it really boiled down to was 4 recommendations at the end that had no connection to those taxes. First was enact CARTA, so check, we've done that. Second one was conduct a rural transit needs assessment. John has just completed that, so we don't need to necessarily focus on that. But the third is continue our engagement with the rural counties so that when we're developing our legislative package, they're included, they're at the table, and they are potentially coming to the table and joining as CARTA members. So we've continued that engagement despite the fact that we're not going to be responsible for the rural transit needs assessment, but we are still going to maintain that relationship and try to pull them along with us.
And do y'all have those sort of relationships with?
We did some outreach over the summer and fall, and through the PDC. And the last one is engage UVA, which we have done the preliminary steps of doing that. We would like them to participate in some way as a non-voting member, and they have recognized. They have recognized that they're interested in that. I don't know that we've gotten a firm commitment from them on participation, but they have expressed interest. So that takes us to the work that we'll start doing hopefully this year. And I say hopefully, and I mean, we're gonna be doing it this year. We're hoping we get extra money to do more of it. We put in a DRPT grant for technical assistance to look at our transit vision plan, look at those constrained and unconstrained networks that we put out a few years ago. Also look at our transit service plans. CAT has its own plan, Jaunt has its own plan. UTS has its own plan, but isn't really published. So we want to work with all of those, see where we can move forward specific priorities in the region. What routes do we want to put extra funding on? So we're going to have that conversation whether DRPT gives us money or not. We're hoping they do give us funding. And if you're listening to DRPT, we would like some funding.
So when will we know about the grant?
So we put in the grant at the end of January, I believe it was the 31st, last day of the month. I believe we hear sort of the draft recommendation to CTV in April.
Okay.
And then there's another CTV meeting
And that
later, but.
they'll be approving it. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah,
but
okay.
the funding becomes available if we're awarded it in July, August.
Oh, so that's a ways away.
Yeah, so we'll have some preliminary work that we'll need to be doing to sort of scope out what that project looks like with and without money. And then when we get to July, we'll kind of know which way we're going with that.
And I'm sorry, again, what is it that this project, as you called it, will be doing?
So it's basically looking at the transit vision plan and saying, which of these services, and we're gonna break them down, break that network out into individual segments of services and say, which ones are the important ones for us to invest in the near term? And then we'll compare that against what do we have on the ground today. So we may have in the transit vision plan that we want a bunch of service going up 29 on the Route 7. Well, we already have a Route 7. What's the delta that we need to consider here and how much does that cost? So we're really trying to get you to a point of what does it really cost to implement your vision? And how can we do that as soon as possible? So that's what this project is aimed at. We'll be working on it over the course of the year or so, probably through next summer. And then through that, we'll have some pretty decent next steps of what we're doing here. I do want to note that this doesn't just mean which bus lines are we putting service on. This can mean fixed route, this can mean paratransit, this can mean microtransit, this can mean commuter services out to rural locations. All of these things were included in the constrained and unconstrained visions. They're all up for grabs. So got some fun discussions coming around that.
Prioritizing.
Yes.
It will be a big part of it.
Yeah, it's actually basically 2 rounds of prioritizing, because you're going to go through what's in the vision plan, which is all agency agnostic. We didn't say that CAT's running something, or John's running something, or UTS is running something. We we just said, this is where we want our services, this is where we want our frequencies, this is where we want our sort of coverage services, our commuter services. So there'll be a round of looking at it sort of agnostically.
Right, how can we best provide that?
What's the stuff we really want the most? And then there's gonna be a round of comparing it against what is on the ground today and getting that delta of what the cost is, and then we're gonna go through that prioritization again and say, is it worth what we want? Like, we may say this is our top priority, but it may be so expensive that we don't wanna put our money on that first, we wanna put it on something else first. So we'll have multiple rounds of talking through these priorities so we can get it right before we start spending money. And I think that's sort of the review of the intent. The other big issue is we have this legislation, it doesn't quite fit everything we want it to do, so Christine's gonna walk us through how we get to.
Can I ask a couple
Yeah.
of questions, and maybe this is leading into what you were gonna talk about? So, let's just talk about CAT. CAT will stay a member of Charlottesville government. That's the way it is by code, that's the way the federal grants work, all of those things. How would you, and I realize that CAT is only one portion of this larger effort, but it's kind of the biggest one, I guess, or the most financially intensive.
Yeah.
So say we identify some routes and say somehow we end up with some money. Is the notion then we would supplement the work that the city is doing with CAT?
Yeah, so the idea isn't that we're going to figure out how to restructure CAT, Charter, UTS, and pull together a mega organization. Maybe eventually we get there, but that's not really what we have our eyes on in the near term. We really want to make sure that service improving is sort of the guide star of what we're doing. And we don't really care at the moment that CAT sits in one place and John sits in another.
So if you think about the authority as kind of an umbrella, does that make sense?
Yes,
That's the way I think
perfect.
about it, it's like an umbrella, and we have Cat and John, and underneath that umbrella, UTS, and we're trying to figure out, to prioritize what we're trying to do with transit in the community, who does it best, and where maybe we can avoid duplicitous service, because we have some of that too.
Well, and we also tend to focus on the CATs, the Johns, the UTSs. We also have a lot of private providers in our community that are providing health services. I know that PATH is helping organize a lot of that and figuring out how we get people from one place to another. That's transit. We just don't call it a transit service, so we might want to figure out how we bake in that as
Look
well.
at those, yeah.
Any other questions on sort of?
I'm
Our
your
scope.
official timekeeper, so we have, 8 minutes? Go.
Alright, so for the next one, I think it's a little of a misnomer, it's not really the General Assembly timeline, it's really more next steps. So I think it's important that our long game is to eventually go to the General Assembly to ask for dedicated revenue in order to be able to pay for services that go towards this vision. I don't think that's our next step, frankly, and I think most of us in the room would agree with that. We have a lot of work to do locally first, and we have a lot of relationship building and educating to do at the state level. So I would say the short term is the next series of meetings are reviewing things like the draft resolution meeting says, more organizational things, getting an MOU in place with the Planning District Commission, beginning to prioritize through this study if we are fortunate enough to get funding, prioritize actions. And then I think in the next 12 to 24 months, the authority is really going to be looking at legitimizing the existing authority, that we are demonstrating to the state the cooperation, the collaboration in order to implement, not just study what we're going to do next. So it's to actually begin implementation so that we can then go before the state to say, with all of the local resources that we have, here's what we were able to accomplish, and here is what we need in order to get to the full vision that we have established.
And this is what we need, and this is how we would like to get it.
Yeah. And so just as a point of information, at the next RTP meeting next week, we do have Danny Plogger, who is the executive director of the Virginia Transit Association, coming to talk about current legislation at the General Assembly, some trends in the Commonwealth related to transit, and then his experience with the different transportation authorities and transit funding that have happened in other regions. so that we can continue to educate ourselves, but then we can also talk about what might be a path for CARTA moving forward related to dedicated.
And VTA is a really good resource for us. I was on the VTA board and actually chaired it for a while. But, and Danny's great, and that will be a really good resource, I would say, for us. So I'm excited he's coming. That's good. We can tap into.
So that's all I have, is just kind of laying out what we plan to be doing for the next, 6, 12 months and beyond.
Is it premature to invite our delegates and state senator to just roundtable with us one meeting? Just want to say, this is what we're doing, not really, yeah, I mean, just a general information session, and I think they have some sense of what we're doing, maybe.
Well, we did that at one point, Brian, we did bring them in. Of course, it's been a while now. I would think we need to do a little bit more work, it would seem like to me, so that we have more concrete information to give them. And maybe that's this summer, I don't know. Kristen, what do you think? Yeah.
I would think that, we've talked about, Christine used the word legitimizing the authority. And maybe what we need to do is sort of get a bit more information. Hopefully we'll get the grant, we can do some prioritization, identify where are a few of our wins that we want to see, and maybe that's the right time to begin to engage with the legislative body when we sort of have a plan, a couple of steps out.
I just don't want to get so far in a plan, and then we talk with them, and they're like, well, it'd be good if you talk to us.
Right,
Maybe they've got suggestions. I don't know.
right.
And maybe like Natalie says, it's more a matter of just informal conversations with them, but.
So the Regional Transit Partnership did bring Cree in at that time, Sally. It was Cree and Sally and I can't remember who else it was. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But we did talk to them. But and we were saying, we're the partnership, we want to establish an authority, this is the work. It was a very general conversation.
And we've got new people now, obviously,
Yeah.
we've got, I got
Katrina
Carlson.
Amy.
Yeah.
And it's good to do that, we just might need to do
Yeah,
a little
makes
more
sense.
time to get
Yeah,
organized.
I think you're absolutely right.
Put
And
it on the to-do
certainly,
list.
Right.
certainly we'll want to have really good, for them to have a really good sense before we go back to the General Assembly on everything we're doing and what we're asking, right?
I know Carlson's legislative aid is pretty well read in on this, so
Yeah.
he's up to speed, but beyond that, I'm not sure what else our representatives know.
Absolutely. The only last item that I have in that one is, are there other things on your minds that would populate an agenda moving forward? Are there other things you would like us to consider? Are there other speakers you'd like to bring here in order to learn from? Like, anything that you guys can think that we haven't already in our work group identified? We definitely want you all to inform this process. So just leaving that open for if you are thinking of things, like, we haven't really thought about that, then we'd like to leave space for that on the agenda moving forward.
We've done so much work in the RTP that I feel like many of those questions we've explored.
Would it be helpful to have a discussion at some point with DRPT about it? I just know.
Well, DRPT, I mean, there's folks
They're
online
right
right
there.
now with us. I mean,
Yeah.
they were on even like steering committees for the studies, like they
Yeah, they
have
were.
they
Yeah.
have been engaged, they
Yeah.
understand where we are in our developmental stage, where we are trying to go. I think we will continuously be having conversations with them as we're moving this body forward.
At some point,
And
I
there's-
wonder,
Many of them on here.
Katie's the only one left.
Katie's
Okay,
left.
yeah.
Thank you, Kate.
Oh.
For sticking with us, yeah.
I know. Happy to stay on. I think the rest just dropped off.
No.
at some point, I wonder if there might be a space for input from like these kind of hyper-local stakeholders representing population concentrations. I'm thinking, if we're running service to Fluvanna, there's really only one community that realistically makes sense getting service. And so, like, does it make sense to get input from the HOA of the lake? You know, like truly, right? Like that sounds stupid, but like
No, I think you're
they are
right. I
a
think
huge locality inside a locality, basically. And I'm sure there are corollaries other potential rural partners.
And I do think at some point, we're gonna have to figure out how this umbrella works with John under it and even Cat. And I think, Mike has expressed in some of the partnership meetings concerns about how John will fit into this. So having those discussions, I think with Mike Murphy and John would be really appropriate.
We do have a sort of working group that's meeting
Oh,
as well, and so that is with UVA, Cat, and
Okay,
John.
so that might be
And
one of
that,
those.
those are regular, they've agreed to regular meetings.
Oh, good.
We're having difficulty arriving at a regular time, but we're working through the agenda. Thank you, Lucinda, on that. But that, I think that's a really positive sign
That's
that that we're gonna meet regularly with them to talk about priorities and talk about this study.
So that's the place for that, so I think that's great.
And if and when we are able to raise substantial money ourselves, then there'll be a lot of interest.
There will be, that's right, that's right.
You all might be super popular.
There might not be as much, I don't want to say conflict, but friction between the job board and CARTA. Job board recently had their retreat with their entire board, it was like a day-long thing. And then,
One of the
two
top
or
five
three,
priorities.
they did a big prioritization thing, and one of the top priorities was get along with CARTA. Make sure that
Engage,
That's great.
engage with CARTA.
Yeah.
That's really good,
That's
that's
awesome.
awesome.
I may
great.
have had my finger on that. Because I'm on the job board, but.
That's really good, and I understand the angst.
Yeah, no, it makes sense,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
they see that there is value in this, in helping their agency continue going forward, so.
All right. And that's good. Does anybody have anything else they want to chat about or discuss or? And I don't have the date here for our next meeting if I'm going to adjourn us to our next
March.
Will you help me with
Yes,
that?
ma'am. Somebody else can pull it up quicker.
I'm happy to adjourn us, but I need a date.
March 27th.
March 27th at 5
5
o'clock.
p.m.
So I'm adjourning us to March 27th at 5 o'clock, same location. All right. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
There you go,
Thanks to
thank
all
you.
y'all and all the work that y'all done putting this together, I really appreciate it.
This was great.
Yeah, great meeting.
It's exciting, isn't it?
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you guys
Katie.
online.
Bye, Katie. Thank you, sweetheart.